Over to you, Dirk. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. So welcome all of you in my own name as well, wherever you are, to this event, which is part of a series of activities proposed by the Translating Minority Voices Network. And I'm very grateful to Tifan Levik for having invited me to chair this session on translation and multilingualism, which is a wonderful topic in itself and one in which I've taken an interest myself. As we all know, at a societal and cultural level, the connections between translation and multilingualism are multiple and complex. Multilingualism and translation would appear to form a perfect and natural match. They are natural bedfellows, so to speak. It is multilingualism that creates the need for translation, and at first sight, translation might look like the most logical solution when a multilingual situation creates a communication gap. But then, upon reflection, we can see that translation and multilingualism are also forces pulling in opposite directions. The more bilingualism, the less translation. The more translation, the less bilingualism. In a society where bilingualism is widespread, the need for systematic translation will hardly arise. And in a society where texts are systematically translated, monolingual speakers will have no incentive to leave their monolingual cocoon and learn other languages. Now, in today's seminar, we shall explore the further complications that arise when texts to be translated themselves contain instances of multilingualism, but here the term often preferred is heterolingualism, and perhaps also instances of intra-diegetic or intratextual translation. Literary translation is never an easy task, but perhaps nowhere does it become more challenging than when the language gap itself needs to be rendered somehow. A research topic that has been gaining more and more attention, and I think that a key publication has been the special issue of Target in 2006, which most of you will be familiar with. And two speakers are going to help us unpack the complexities involved. Julie Loison-Charles, or Charles, and Amanda Murphy. I will first listen to Julie, a talk of 25 minutes or so, which is going to be followed by a first round of questions and answers. And then we'll go to Amanda, who again will talk for 25-30 minutes, followed by questions and answers. And that should leave us with some time to open up the discussion and try to connect the two papers and explore wider issues. And all of this should be ready more or less by 6:30, because then it's going to get close to dinner time. Julie is Associate Professor of English and Translation Studies at the Université de Lille. And her book monograph from 2016 deals with Nabokov's use of foreign words in his novels in English. Julie has published extensively on related topics such as Nabokov, heterolingualism, wordplay, and translation. And Julie has now two new books in the pipeline, both of which deal somehow with the translation of multilingual texts or authors, our central theme today. So one deals with la traduction du multilinguisme dans les séries TV, doublé vers le français, les mots français dans les séries anglophones, which is going to come out soon from Artois, Presse Université. And the second book in the pipeline has the self-explanatory title Nabokov as an author translator, and that will be published by Bloomsbury. Clearly, we are in absolutely safe hands today. Julie, I'm happy to give the floor to you.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for connecting today. So I'll jump in, but I'll start with sharing my screen, which you should all see now. There we go. Good, and I'll just reduce the window here. There we go. All right. So in his English language novels, Nabokov employs several foreign languages. And on this slide, oops, hang on, it's not. Okay, so it's not working. Hang on a minute. Why is it not? It is working now, good. So on this slide, I've included quite a large variety of languages: French, German, Latin, and Russian. But the two languages Nabokov uses the most are Russian and French. The fact that his novels in English included mainly Russian and French is hardly surprising, since he was trilingual, as he said quite immodestly. I was a perfectly normal trilingual child in a family with a large library. His bilingualism with English and Russian is widely known, especially because he indulged in self-translation, which makes him one of the most famous cases of self-translating authors, with Samuel Beckett, Elsa Triolet, Julian Green, and Nancy Houston, to name but a few. Before switching to English with his first novel in this language, The Real Life of Sebastian Knight, Nabokov had written several novels in Russian, and after his transition to English in the 1940s, he continued to write poetry in Russian. But not everyone knows that he mastered French so well that he could have become a French writer if history had given him a chance. He did write, however, in this language. The short story Mademoiselle O and the essay Pushkin ou le vrai, le vraisemblable. He also translated from and into French. You have a few examples on the slide. And he also translated himself into French. Only one short story has been published, Musica, so it's the only known example, but actually I have found another one in the archives. And as I will show, the extensive part he played in the translation of his novels into French means they can be considered a type of self-translation. Today, I will focus on the presence of French in the novels that Nabokov wrote in English, and I will examine what these French words became in French translation. Translating French into French is tricky, especially because it seems hard to render this je ne sais quoi that French has in English. I will concentrate on Lolita, which was published in English but in Paris in 1955 by Olympia Press. There are many reasons why I made this choice. First, because this novel is obviously the most famous one. Then, because French is the main foreign language in this novel, and for once, there is no Russian at all. And finally, the novel has been retranslated 20 years ago, so it means it's possible to make a diachronic comparison between the 1959 translation made by Eric Kahn and Nabokov and the 2001 translation by Maurice Couturier. First, I will discuss the translation of French into French by evoking this tricky topic in general, and then I'll zoom in on Nabokov to see how it was done in his novels and to see Nabokov's stance on the topic. Then I'll concentrate on Lolita and on the strategies which are to be found in the 1959 translation. I will show that the French code switching of the original becomes, I will show what it becomes in the French translation, but also how the French Lolita has retained some kind of multilingualism despite the conundrum of translating French into French. Finally, by comparing the creativity of the Kahn Nabokov translation to the fidelity of the Couturier translation, I will discuss the retranslation hypothesis, but I will also try and shed light on the need to reconsider collaborative translations as mediated self-translations. Today, my presentation harnesses theories advanced in genetic translation studies, particularly concerning collaborative translation. Here is a quick definition by two leading specialists in the field. Over the past decade, a new field of research has emerged that may be termed genetic translation studies. It analyzes the practices of the working translator and the evolution or genesis of the translated text by studying translators' manuscripts, drafts, and other working documents. Therefore, I will be using archives I have consulted in the US, more specifically in the New York Public Library and in Cornell University, but also in France, in the Gallimard archives and in the IMEC in Caen. So, translating French into French. When scholars study the translation of multilingualism in a text, they tend to use the terminology of Sternberg in his 1981 article. He described two main strategies. First, the multilingualism of the text is kept in the translation, and this he calls vehicular matching. So that's two. You can see the quote on the slide. The second strategy is the homogenizing convention, and it consists in erasing any trace of the foreign language. It is rather easy to keep the multilingual dimension of a text when the foreign language used in the source text is also foreign in the target text. Let's take an example from Ada. Pas j'en sabies glouposti. Please no silly things, especially devant les gens, said deeply flattered Marina. Vehicular matching means that the Russian words used in the novel in English, pas j'en sabies glouposti, are kept as such in the French translation. So that's what you see on the right column. But when it comes to translating French into French, for example, devant les gens, it is more complicated. In my forthcoming book on dubbing TV shows, I have studied this topic extensively, and I have seen that French is usually changed to Italian or Spanish, for example, in this famous scene from Friends, where French becomes Spanish. More rarely, French is turned into German or Dutch. When French is used in TV series, it is often one isolated word, usually in connection with seduction or sex, for example, ménage à trois, or food with hors d'oeuvre, crudité, for example, or bon appétit. It's also used to give a recherche dimension to one's speech. It is therefore rather easy to rewrite it in another language. But in Nabokov's novels, the presence of French can usually be explained by the fact that the character is French or studied French extensively. Lolita, for example, the mother tongue of the narrator, Humbert, is French, as we see in this passage. I was born in 1910 in Paris. My father was a gentle, easygoing person, a salad of racial genes, a Swiss citizen of mixed French and Austrian descent, with a dash of the Danube in his veins. Therefore, changing Humbert's French into another language would mean rewriting his autobiography. This is probably why vehicular matching is almost never found in the translation of French into French in Nabokov's novels. However, I will show you one example of it in Lolita and some strategies that are rather close to it. With the homogenizing convention, so when you erase traces of multilingualism, French is usually kept as such in the translation, but there are actually two ways of doing it in a written text. Either there is a typographical indication, like italics, either there isn't. A typographical indication is to be found in Lolita. On the first occurrence of French in the novel, he, mon cher petit papa, in the French translation, the translation gives those words in italics with an asterisk, and a note explains that all words written like that were en français dans le texte, in French, in the original text. In the first translation of Lolita, the expression pot au feu, for example, is used twice, the first time with the typographical indication and the second time without it, which means that the fact that French was used in the original text is lost on the French reader. This typographical indication is used in Nabokov's first novels published in French, but not with the latest, for example, Ada, as we see in the quote I've given before. Here, devant les gens is not in italics and you don't have any asterisks. At first, I thought it was because it was not the same publisher. Lolita was published by Gallimard, but Ada was published by Fayard. However, my research in the archives showed me that Nabokov was, in fact, quite surprisingly, opposed to this typographical convention, as we can see in the next three examples. I might give it. You can read it in French and I'll read it in English. Nowhere should there be any note en français dans le texte, an old battlefield between me and my French publishers. Second one, en français dans le texte should be eliminated wherever it occurs. French words which appear in French in the English original must not be italicized. Nabokov was even playful with the expression when he discussed the translation of Pale Fire. Another thing, I strongly object to the customary footnotes en français dans le texte. They are absurd in our cosmopolitan era. Moreover, this particular novel, which is organically based on a system of notes, cannot have other notes attached to it at tort and travers. And a bit further down, ceci dit, en français dans le texte, I wish to add in a loud and clear voice that the texture of the translators is a marvel, etc. Let us now see how French words were translated, or rather rendered, in the two French translations of Lolita. in my study of the translation by Kahn and Nabokov, I've seen that roughly 50% of the French occurrences were indicated thanks to typography, while the others had just no indication whatsoever. So the example I gave before, pot-au-feu, is quite exemplary in that respect. Here are two screenshots of my analysis. On the left, you have the original by Nabokov. In the middle, you have the translation by Kahn and Nabokov. And in the last column, you have Couturier's translation. With the first screenshot, you have an example of the 50-50 balance in the middle column. So you have report, italique, astérix, then nothing, then it's a typographical indication, then no typographical indication, then indication again. With the second screenshot, you can see that occasionally, the first translation slightly amended the French from the original by reinserting accents, for example, as in départé, or with capital letters, as you can see with Monsieur, or Berthe au grand pied in number 15 above. One can wonder who took the decision to reduce the quantity of French in the first translation, or rather to reduce the visual signaling of the original French. It was actually a decision taken by both co-translators. Indeed, in two letters from early 1958, Nabokov is the first one to mention it, and then Kahn suggests they go further. Nabokov, you will note that I have eliminated some French formulas which clash with my imagery. Kahn, moreover, I should like to tone down a bit some of the French words or sentences in the original version. They have a raison d'être in English, but they often clash with a French context, most of them being colloquialism of sorts inserted in a very academic context. Furthermore, if printed in italics with an asterisk added, those words acquire a visual importance which is often unnecessary and far-fetched. So, if you agree, I'd like to incorporate in the text the most awkward of them, and here or there remodel them, so as not to give them undue preeminence. Let us now look at one specific example in context to see what the two translations actually look like. In the following passage, Humbert explains to Lolita what she risks if she tells anyone what kind of relationship they have. Basically, if she denounces him for the pedophile he is. Ma chère Dolores, I want to protect you, dear, from all the horrors that happen to little girls in coal sheds and alleyways. And alas, comme vous le savez trop bien, ma gentille, in the blueberry woods during the bluest of summers. Through thick and thin, I will stay your guardian. And if you are good, I hope a court may legalize that guardianship before long. Kahn and Nabokov. Ma chère Dolores, je veux te préserver de toutes les horreurs qui guettent les petites filles dans les impasses et les caves à charbon. Et comme tu le sais, hélas trop bien, ma gentille, au fond des bois de myrtille dans le bleu de l'été. Couturier. Ma chère Dolores, je veux te protéger, ma chérie, de toutes les horreurs qui surviennent aux petites filles dans les hangars à charbon et les impasses, et aussi, hélas, comme vous le savez trop bien, ma gentille, dans les bois ARL lors des mois estivaux les plus égrillards. There are 3 points I would like to underline. First, in Couturier's translation, the typographical conventions I mentioned before are used, but not in the one by Kahn and Nabokov. The second translation might seem typographically heavier than the first, but actually, the original also included italics. It did not, however, include asterisks. Then you may have noticed that Dolores' name is spelled differently. It has an accent in the first translation, but it doesn't have one in the second translation, which means that Dolores, Lolita, may look more French in the first translation and more American in the second one. Finally, in both translations, Humbert uses tu to speak to Dolores, but if we look at the second case of code switching, comme vous le savez trop bien, ma gentille, we notice that Courier's fidelity to the original produces a jarring effect since Humbert alternates between tu and vous. On the other hand, the first translation inserts hélas for alas in the middle of the original French sentence, so it's a bit of amending, as I mentioned before. As I've shown, French is generally not turned into a foreign language, and it is kept as such in the translation. However, in other places, some foreign words have been included in the first translation, for example, with Italian. A brightly lit set of rooms, une suite de pièces éclairées a giorno, in a rising rhythm qui allait crescendo, on the so-called piazza, ce qu'on appelle ici la piazza. Even more interesting, English is sometimes added, As you can see with the second screenshot, les mères les plus select, votre home vous reflète, aux garden parties, ou enjoliver le reflet du home, ces vieux blue jeans sales. Let's look at a specific example now. All she wanted from life was to be one day a strutting and prancing baton twirler or a jitterbug. Elle n'avait d'autre ambition dans la vie que de danser le jitterbug et être une des drum majorettes de l'équipe locale de rugby ou rugby. In the following letter, Kahan asked Nabokov if he's sure they should use the word majorette. His use of humor through a reference to Nabokov's text is rather entertaining. Majorette, I do know what they are. In fact, I was once, mais je digresse. I had decided to let it go as pin-up de l'équipe de rugby, as the martial aid had introduced the pin-up in Europe, but not the drum majorette nor the cheerleader. Here again, the long explanation slows down the action, and the whole idea is not really indispensable. However, if you want to keep it, we'll manage somehow. In the margin, Nabokov's answer is written in pencil, do. If one looks at the passage which is discussed, it's interesting to see that majorette is actually not used in the English, where Charlotte is very critical of her own daughter. Now, at 12, she was a regular pest, said Hayes. All she wanted from life was to be one day a strutting and prancing baton twirler or a jitterbug. In the French translation, majorette has been inserted with drum before it, but a reference to English sport has been added. In the slide and in the next one, I've underlined additions. Aujourd'hui, à 12 ans, poursuivit Hayes, c'était une vraie peste. Elle n'avait d'autre ambition dans la vie que de danser le jitterbug et d'être une des drum majorettes de l'équipe locale de rugby. It's not in the original. A similar insertion of English words and references to American culture can be found in the following passage dealing with Lolita's favorite things in life. So you have additions like à la mode des cowboys, des ice creams américaines, les magazines de Hollywood. I'll finish with what seems to be the only example of vehicular matching in the first translation of Lolita. A bilingual pun with French becomes a pun with German. So in the second part of the book, when Humbert manages to find Lolita after she escaped from him, she's older and pregnant. And more importantly, she finally tells him who she ran away with, Claire Quilty. Humbert is particularly hurt to discover that, though Lolita never loved him, she deeply cared for Quilty. However, Quilty left Lolita because she refused to comply with all his sexual desires. That's what she describes. Crazy things, filthy things. I said, no, I'm just not going to. She used in all insouciance, really, a disgusting slang term, which in a literal French translation would be soufflé, you beastly boys, because I only want you. Well, he kicked me out. Shocked as he is by Lolita's revelation and immodest language, Humbert hides in French disguise the verb blow, referring to oral sex in English, but of course not in French. Here, Nabokov and Kahan resorted to German to achieve a similar effect, apparently on Kahan's suggestion. This is how the published translation reads. Ici, elle employa en toute insouciance, je vous l'assure, un terme d'argot des plus répugnants qui, traduit mot à mot dans le Schweizerdeutsch de l'oncle Trapp, serait auspumpen. And this is what Kahn writes. He's very proud of his find and he asks that Nabokov's modification makes the result perfect. J'espère que vous avez aimé ma trouvaille dont je suis très fière pour résoudre le problème du soufflé. Je dois dire que votre correction de l'oncle Trapp pour le Schweizerdeutsch de mon enfance makes it perfect. So Kahan had used Schweizerdeutsch de mon enfance, the Swiss German of my childhood, thus referring to Humbert having a Swiss father, as mentioned in a previous slide. So his father was a Swiss citizen of mixed French and Austrian descent with a dash of the Danubian name. So German is actually explained here. However, Humbert is always presented as speaking French, not German. So Nabokov's correction, in order to refer to his Swiss relative, de l'oncle Trapp, is particularly brilliant because in the second part of the novel, Humbert repeatedly compares the man following Lolita and him throughout the United States to his uncle, Gustave Trapp. This translation is therefore the result of Nabokov and Kahan's joint efforts. And what makes it particularly delightful is that almost a year before the Swiss-German pun was found, Kahan was already using German to tease Nabokov. Thus, in a letter in February 1958, he congratulates Nabokov on the way he translated gooseberry into French, and he writes, "It is a beautiful word, but where in Himmel did you find it? It is unknown in the Grosser, Larousse, the Littré, the Robert, etc. I would love to use it, but can you produce its French birth certificate? No proof, no soap, and that would be a shame. Now, excuse my German, aber, as Humbert's uncle Gustav used to say, sicher ist and must be sicher." Now that we know how the translation of French was managed in the two French Lolitas, let's see what status the French Lolita, translated by Kahn and Nabokov, has in relation to self-translation and retranslation. In his article, Author-Translator Collaborations, a Typological Survey, Patrick Hersant defines three types of collaborative translation: revision, close collaboration, which he calls a particular form of mediated self-translation, and authorial appropriation. Hersant shows that when it came to the English translation of his Russian novels, Nabokov was a typical case of authorial appropriation. There is no argument about the validity of this statement. This is what Brian Boyd writes about the translations of Nabokov's Russian novels. Once he had polished the English translation to his satisfaction, Nabokov would then arrange for subsequent translations into other languages to be made from the English rather than the Russian text, not only because there were far more translators available from English than from Russian, but also because Nabokov regarded the English language versions with the minor glosses as textually definitive for non-Russian readers. For the translations from Russian into English, things are clear. Nabokov's collaborative translations become new originals and are recognized as self-translations through the process of authorial appropriation. However, when the target language is French, hardly anyone would use the term self-translation, at least not outside some French scholars. At best, specialists think that Nabokov merely revised the French translations, but they are usually unaware of Nabokov's role in the translating process, which is not surprising if one looks at the paratext. In the French Lolita, for example, Nabokov is not mentioned at all, nothing like revised by or read by or in cooperation with or collaboration, nothing. If Nabokov did not defend his role in the translations into French as much as in the translations into English, I think it's because he had different agendas. In English, he wanted to be recognized as an American author. However, he had no intention of becoming a French author in the 1950s and after that. He had tried and failed to become a writer in France before he moved to the United States. For the French collaborative translations, it is my contention that they should be considered mediated self-translations, especially when one sees, thanks to the archives, the role that Nabokov played in them. It is clear that the first translation by Kahn and Nabokov teems with creativity. This creativity further underlines that the French translation of Lolita is a type of self-translation, as self-translation is characterized by an association of creation and translation, as Mikhail Ustinov showed in his book on self-translation. So I'll just read the French because you have an English beneath that. L'autotraduction est un domaine obéissant à une logique propre qui tient à son octorialité et qui est aussi le lieu privilégié où apparaissent avec le plus d'acuité les problèmes liés au bilinguisme d'écriture. Elle est éminemment à la fois traduction et écriture, si bien qu'il ne faudrait pas la réduire à l'écriture seule, en la rangeant dans le champ de la recréation, comme on a tendance à le faire trop souvent. Delving into Nabokov's archives shows how important his creative role was. In that respect, it seems important to reevaluate the translations of his novels into French as partly self-translations or mediated self-translations, as Patrick Hersant calls them. However, defending these texts could possibly question the value of retranslations or even revisions. One questioning point is Couturier's 2001 translation of Lolita. Unfortunately, the translation made by Kahn and Nabokov was heavily criticized when Lolita was retranslated in 2001. But I think it's excessive to attack the lack of fidelity to the original text by arguing that Nabokov probably did not revise this translation as much as he could have if he had had more time. To show Nabokov's supposed dissatisfaction with Kahan's translation, Couturier quotes letters in which Nabokov criticized Kahan's translation before it was amended, but he does not quote the ones he wrote when the pages were amended according to his wishes, or when the translation was over. What should be kept in mind is that Nabokov approved of the French translation, as evidenced by the fact that in his 1967 Russian translation, he insisted that i siete переводов я дичаю в смысле точности полноты только за французский, который я сам проверил до напечатания. So you approved of it. Another proof of his approval is that after the French translation of Lolita was published, Nabokov repeatedly asked Gallimard to turn to Kahan again for the translation of his other books. Despite his arrangements with the chronology of the letters, Couturier was actually right in arguing that his translation was more faithful to the original for at least two reasons. First, the Kahan-Nabokov translation implied a high degree of creativity, which is normal if one takes it as a type of self-translation. In that respect, it is creative instead of merely translating. Secondly, translation theory tends to confirm the natural tendency of second translations for more fidelity in what is usually called the retranslation hypothesis. Generally speaking, retranslations are needed to give a closer access to the original. As Berman and Ben-Simon argued, new translations are generally more faithful to the source text than the first translations. And of course, it's a generality, it's not always true. Therefore, the reader's access to the original is usually facilitated by the new translations, like Couturier's translation. And it is even more the case when they are published in annotated editions, as it is now the case for Nabokov's work in the prestigious Pléiade collection, which was edited by Maurice Couturier himself. To finish on those translations, one needs to wonder what the French reader wants to read. If they want a French translation of the English Lolita, they should definitely read Couturier's translation. But if they want to read Nabokov's Lolita in French, then they should probably turn to the Kahan-Nabokov version if they can find it. In conclusion, I want to say that, French was, I forgot this one, never mind. French was clearly a beloved language for Nabokov. Not only did he use it overwhelmingly in his novels, but he devoted an incredible amount of time and energy to the translations of his books into French. My hope is that his involvement in the French translations can help re-evaluate them as types of self-translations, but also that it can underline that Nabokov was more than a bilingual writer. He was a trilingual author who valued his three languages as forming a whole, which he once called a troika. This is what he answered to the following question by a French journalist. Do you think that your knowing three languages, Russian, French, and English, has made a difference? Here is his answer. I like words. Yes, I know these three languages well. This troika, these three horses I have always hooked up to my carriage. And that will be all. And I'll stop sharing my screen. There.
Thank you so much, Julie, for pulling the carriage of this seminar so effectively. Great paper, good examples, and very insightful analysis. And you've brought together, quite interestingly, a number of important research strands in contemporary translation research, the genetic turn, the archival turn, the collaborative turn, if we can call it that way, and so forth and so on. We can now open the floor to to questions. I don't know if anyone wants to come forward and put a question to you. We've got 5 or 10 minutes for a first round of questions.
There's Laetitia who has a question.
Laetitia, yeah.
Hello everybody. Julie, it's always a pleasure to hear more about your work. I love Nabokov, although I'm really not a specialist, I'm an early modernist. I was wondering, because what I know about him is that he experienced translations into foreign languages which he found terrible, and that prompted him to early on in his career, and that prompted him to actually translate his own works into other languages, that is to say English works back into Russian, etc. I was wondering whether this, in what you have read and in your analysis, whether we can see that this has played a role in the way he writes his later works. That is to say, with all this multilingual context and the insertion of multilingualism in the novels, whether we can feel that he had potential translation in mind when he was writing, or whether we actually have information about his envisioning future translations of his works, and whether that had an impact on the way he was writing multilingually.
There are many points in your question. Thank you for it. Several things. Self-translation, you mentioned the difficulty in self-translation, or was it in translation only?
No, that he was really dissatisfied with an early translation into English of one of his, was it Russian novels?
Yes, so that's so you're right. He was dissatisfied, and then he decided to retranslate the text. So he did that actually twice, the self-translation from Russian into English. So, but the thing is that it was also such a difficult task to translate himself that's why he tended to ask others to do it, and then he would scrupulously revise it and be very intrusive and very, very difficult with the translators. And it seems that it's because he knew that he was prone to rewriting that he would ask others to translate them. So he did self-translate with Lolita, for example, from English into Russian, but he stopped doing it because it was too hard. Then the fact that did it have an impact on his way of writing? I'm not too sure, but he knew he would collaborate to most of the translations into lots of languages. I do know that Couturier said that he found it surprisingly easy to translate Nabokov, especially Lolita, into French, because he felt a kind of French network or French tendency. So he said lots of novels were difficult to translate, but Lolita kind of French was already here. So I'm not sure how it impacted his writing, but it did know that it was going to be translated, and he said it gave him nightmare to imagine what it would become in other languages.
And it was actually utterly misunderstood in English too. So I find it extremely ironic and funny that his fear of being misunderstood when translated should have actually realized in the original language, not because of the change of language, but because people missed out on the irony of the novel altogether. So I thought I was, that he was always had this in mind. Well, thank you anyway. I'll leave the floor.
Thank you for your question.
Good. Any other question at this point? Can I put one to you, Julie? I was wondering why is it that the publisher Gallimard did not capitalize on the fact that the 1959 translation was done, at least in part, by the author itself? It would have given them a commercial, advantage, perhaps.
For a long time, so Couturier explains that for a long time, Gallimard refused to have the novel retranslated. And I understand that it's because Nabokov translated it himself. But Couturier explains that he showed the letters to and the text to Nabokov's son, who thought that it needed to be retranslated. And it's only when the son demanded that the text should be retranslated that Gallimard accepted that. But then, there are lots of possibilities about, why Dmitri did not defend his father's translation. It's actually a really thorny question here.
Yeah, in the book that you refer to on collaborative translation, there is this article on Nabokov, and I had a quick look at it. It turned out that the collaborations did not always run very smoothly.
That's the least you can say. Yeah, he was awful with most of his translators. I mean, actually, Can was rather okay, even if he could be a bit difficult. But from what I've seen, the later you check, the harder he gets. And I think it's because he was more and more adamant about his literalist approach to translation. So it was getting really hard. And the article you're mentioning is the one by Olga Anokina. And she quotes this great exchange that I've studied elsewhere between Maurice et Dirk and Nabokov. And they're just fighting, and like Coindreau is saying, I've translated like more than 30 writers, and kind of keep in your place, you are the author and the translator. And Nabokov is like, I've had 60 translators, so you don't tell me where I stop it. So that's actually very funny, but it was really difficult, and the limit between author and translator is a very tricky one, especially in collaborative translation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you for your question.
Anyone else at this point? Because there will obviously be room for further questions at the end of the two papers.
So I'll just cut my mic so that Amanda can speak.
Good. Okay, so I'll then move on to introduce our second speaker for today, Amanda. I don't know if you have a PowerPoint presentation to put in place or whether you will need it immediately, but I can already introduce you. So Amanda Murphy is Associate Professor of English and Translation Studies at the Sorbonne Nouvelle, and she holds a bachelor's in French from Miami University in the States, and a master's degree from Columbia University, and then a PhD in comparative literature from the Sorbonne Nouvelle. And her dissertation, which is going to be published very soon, I understand, focuses on 20th and 21st century multilingual experimental writing, considering it from the perspectives of writing and reading and also translation. And in addition to that academic work, Amanda has translated herself work in the social sciences, including a book on Borges, and she's now beginning a new or a set of new translation projects in poetry, which is quite interesting. Amanda's publications focus on translingual and multilingual writers, including Ornella Vorpsi and Raymond Federman, and also the two authors that she's going to discuss in today's paper, the Korean-American writer, but also filmmaker and performance artist, Teresa Hak-Kyung-Ka, and the Hungarian-French author, Katalin Molnar. And I do apologize for mangling the pronunciations of these names. Dr. Murphy, dear Amanda, over to you.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I have to preface this by saying that I have
Amanda, I think there might be a problem with your connection.
Yeah, we're struggling a bit with the sound.
connection. Can you all
It's
hear me?
it's a little distorted.
Well, I'm afraid that I have a weak connection. I don't know. I think I might just quickly change rooms then, because
Yeah, sure, no
I don't
problem.
have a good connection.
No problem.
Otherwise, we may have to do without the camera, as long as we have sound.
Mm.
Well, it's still, the sound is still distorted, so I'm not sure that will work. But it's fine if she needs to keep the camera off as well. Obviously,
We'll see.
yeah. Always afraid of these technical problems happening right in the middle. But at least it's at the beginning, and we'll be able to sort it out.
Oh, Tifan, this is nothing. Just last year we had a PhD defense, and one of the jury members was Jean Bessières from Paris, and we lost him halfway the defense.
The person
Most
defending
embarrassing.
the thesis.
And we had to start all over again, moving from Teams to Zoom, and we retrieved him in the end, but it was a very stressful affair.
Yeah,
and I can see
that
Amanda has emerged again.
Yes, I've emerged. I'm in my basement now, where the connection is surprisingly actually better. So very sorry about this.
That's okay.
Thanks very much.
So thank you everyone again, and thank you for the invitation, Tiffany and everyone who's part of this network. I'm very grateful to be able to talk about this topic, which has been neglected for a long time and is now starting to be really a common topic. So I'm very enthusiastic. My presentation today focuses on the translation of what can be called bi, multi, or heterolingual literature. I'm going to first touch briefly on the way this type of translation of literature, is apprehended by scholars, then on the way it's been translated or not translated. And we'll then take a pragmatic and reflexive approach to look at a few examples and discuss specific challenges these texts between languages and cultures pose for translation. And we'll see that in drawing us away from what Chiara Denti has called the monolingual paradigm, and I'm indebted to her research on this, multilingual writing also brings us to reconsider the practice, not as a movement from one language to another, but as reconfiguration of the relationship between the languages present in a text, and as re-enunciation. Bi, multi, or heterolingual literary writing is often either considered exceptional when associated with certain canonical writers like Nabokov, or associated with post-colonial and diasporic writing, and with notions of displacement, migration, and exile. This research is, of course, pertinent, but it often leads us to believe that multilingual writing is a recent or exceptional phenomenon. This is something that Renier Grootman has pointed out, and therefore to focus on these exceptional traits of certain writers or on their biography. Or it leads us to read the works solely for their themes or narratives in the case of post-colonial work, an approach which leads the stories to the stories inadvertently overshadowing the specificities of a work's poetic processes. However, it's often through the treatment of language and the relationship between them within a text that these works signify. As many scholars have reminded us, multilingualism and multilingual writing was highly present during the Middle Ages and until the end of the 17th century. And it wasn't until the 19th century that Romantic ideology was imposed, and the close association between language, nation, and literature or culture dominated. At this time, writing in a national language meant contributing to the construction of a nation, and so translingual or multilingual practices were neglected or considered disloyal, so to speak. Following this peak in the defense of national languages, the phenomenon would neither be given value nor critical attention until post-colonial studies on the need to consider the complexity of literary spaces that we've seen in the past 30, 40 years. As I said, post-colonial scholars tend to focus more on narrative, assimilating manifestations of multilingualism to the imitation of reality or elements of style sometimes, and less on the way languages merge in a creative process, or on the way the creative process reveals the contact, which is always already present, but simply more or less perceptible. This is what the notion of heterolingualism, forged by Grootman and developed by Myriam Suchet, allows us to grasp. It's the fact that a text may contain traces of varying degrees of difference or alterity, be they regional, social, or chronological variations on the main language. But sometimes we have such interweaving of these different elements happening in a text that we can't even detect or declare a main language. And is it really necessary? When translation comes into play, it may be, at least in the discourse on translation, but we could also argue that it may not be. As you can see, thinking about this type of question, we're drifting away a bit from the monolingual paradigm. And a true consideration, in my opinion, of heterolingual works, which put forth the variance inherent in all language and destabilize the idea of languages as fixed entities or delimited entities, is impossible with critical apparatuses built around the paradigm of the nation. This destabilization at hand in multilingual poetics has in part contributed to a lack of consideration of the possibility of translating multilinguality, as well as to the lack of study of such practices, though, as I said, this has been changing recently thanks to scholars like yourselves and events like this. Following the translational turn, researchers like Emily Apter, Michael Cronin, Theo Hermans, Maria Timosco, and Laurence Benuti have acknowledged the intrinsic affinity between multilingualism and the practice of translation, understood as the figurative movement between cultures, which may be somewhat problematic, but these researchers rarely, if not ever, consider the translation of these texts or what they do to translation. And if translation is often used as a metaphor for heterolingual writing, why not take heterolingual writing as a starting point to reconsider models of translation? And this is what Myriam Suchet proposed in 2009 with her Outils pour une traduction postcoloniale. In terms of the actual practice of translation of these texts, when they are translated, the researchers who've taken an interest in this question all agree, well, in the early 2000s. Madeleine Stratford, for example, wrote in 2003, "It must be concluded that the rule in translation is closer to the pure and simple negation of linguistic métissage than to its conservation." Barbara Godard evokes the way that translation is often used to make texts accessible to the target language readers, effectively erasing traces of bilingualism in Québécois literature. And Antoine Berman speaks of the reduction of interlinguistic tension present as texts travel from source language to target language, which he equates to a leveling and simplification of poetic stakes. All of this is what Henri Mechanic denounces as aesthetic domination or literary elegance, marked by the subjective practice of suppressions, additions, displacements, and transformations in function of an idea of what language and literature should be. That's a quote. Many professional translators confirm these same practices imposed by publishing houses, which usually adopt the policy of adapting the text to the readers of the target country, often presumed to be monolingual, with little concern for maintaining the texture of multilingual poetics. And I'd like to point out the book by Brian Lennon, In Babel's Shadow, that really talks about these social dynamics of publishing. Despite the ethical turn in translation studies that has conferred on translation the role of guardian against ethnocentrism, it seems in practice that translation fails in many cases to maintain the degree of alterity present and perceptible in heterolingual texts, those which are precisely the most concerned by the question of difference. This can have, as you might imagine, some quite serious consequences, especially when the source text speaks to us through its minor treatment of language, minority in the sense of the Loison-Charles, or attempts through its poetics to say something about the languages at hand. Standardizing the linguistic aspects of a work to make it more comprehensible is a real injustice, especially when the source text does not aim to be comprehensible, but to produce meaning, sometimes even through incomprehension. Not only does this practice significantly reduce the source text, but it also underestimates readers' capacities and incites passive reading, which is certainly not what most of these texts, as source texts, tend to do. So we might wonder, should these texts be translated at all? If so, by whom and with what critical or translational apparatuses and tools? Indeed, from a point of view that attacks less the translator than translation itself or translation, as it effectively exists, some theorists have highlighted the violence the practice can inflict, or translation itself can inflict. Harish Trivedi, Gayatri Spivak, Emily Apter, Abdel Fattah Kilito, and Kenneth Goldsmith, for example, recognize the faculty of translation to erase difference and highlight the need to resist the temptation of equivalence and the idea of a world that might be totally translatable. From a theoretical standpoint, it would indeed intuitively seem that linguistic plurality is incompatible with translation, which in our traditional view aims to bring a text from one language and space to another. A clear tension, therefore, exists between translation and translatio, or the circulation of text. This is what Dirk was pointing out at the beginning, in introducing the subject, that they don't seem to go together, but they do. Derrida and others arrive at the same conclusion. To further this argument, we might add that these texts are in a way already translated, in that they present the movement of translation. But because something is untranslatable or already translated, does not mean that it should not be translated or retranslated. As Tiffaine Samoyo argues, for example, untranslatability is precisely what calls for or demands translation. Translation becomes a form of retranslation, a non-utilitarian one that doesn't necessarily broaden access. In the case of radically multilingual texts, where the circle of readers is already reduced, and those interested in the work might seek it out regardless of the language, translation is revealed to be simply a rewriting or re-enunciation, another copy of a work available in a different form. In other words, both texts act as originals and translations. There's no longer the same hierarchy as usually exists between originals and translations. In the vision of translation as movement from language A to language B, multilingual texts are untranslatable and even unreadable, as A is not a language. But if we switch from speaking about A and B as languages to A and B as texts, then that participate in the same movement, that of translation, which is already present in text A, that changes our vision of things. And this is the sense of a lot of the research that is being done at the moment. And what we're describing is really what Mechanic prescribes in Poétique du Traduire, abandoning the idea that we translate a language into another language, as well as that of the text as a monolithic authoritative entity. It must instead be considered always already in movement, an idea which makes translation not only possible, but paradoxically, it seems necessary, as the source text calls us to a sort of third space from which translations emerge, or to forge a third text with the original. And that's a term that I've borrowed from Lily Robert Foley with her brilliant dissertation on Beckett, where she reads the versions of French and English versions of Beckett and generates the third text by crossing the both languages. Furthermore, these texts not only deconstruct certain principles of translation studies, they also deconstruct certain preconceived ideas about the translating subject and the operation of translation. Should translators of heterolingual texts not only be bilingual, but have the same linguistic competencies as the writer of the source text? As I suggested earlier, linguistic competence seems less important than what Lise Gauvin calls surconscience linguistique, an awareness of language as a space of fiction or even friction, and imaginary of and by languages. So what does it mean to have this awareness? What kind of practices or strategies does it produce? Well, I'd like to just present a few ideas that I've thought of and practiced, and some that I've borrowed or built on from Myriam Suchet's outil. But before, and then we're going to look at a few examples. So some of the ideas, or pistes, as we could say in French, for translating with this linguistic awareness are the idea of reproducing certain conditions of the writing or reading experience, such as translating from native language to foreign language, contrary to translation doxa, so as to ensure a sense of foreignness is translated. Collaborative translation with translators and authors, potentially from different cultures speaking several languages, in order to reconfigure the cultural and linguistic hybridity present in a source text. Calque or homophonic translation in cases where sound, speech, and accent are potentially important. Adopting writing strategies or ideologies used in the text. I think Paul Bondia talks about that. And in feminist translation, this is certainly pertinent as well. The idea that texts that aim to empower also empower translators. Retranslating or back translating, that is translating once and then translating back into the original language, to highlight the extent to which in the multilingual paradigm, translation is not utilitarian or useful. And finally, translating or transposing potentially into other media, allowing for the elements of of orality or traces of the body in language to reactualize in other regimes of signifying. And actually, these strategies have come to me from the texts themselves, the texts that I've worked on. And I think that's important to note. It's not as if we could simply adopt a coherent and consistent strategy for all multilingual texts. What's key here is to consider the relationship of languages to each other, or the difference of a language to itself. In other words, its relationship to the other. In fact, a translation is an other. So looking at the way the other is treated in a text, the vision of a translation put forth in a text might tell us how a text should be translated or demands to be translated. So after this somewhat cursory exploration of different techniques or history of the practice, let's turn to the pragmatic side of translation to consider some concrete challenges posed by this type of text. So I wanted to look at two works that will serve as a kind of laboratory through which a wide variety of strategies can be employed. So I'm going to share my screen. Oops. Let's see. Okay, can you see that? Yes, okay. So we'll see that between complete erasure of heterolingual elements and complete conservation, many intermediary options are possible, which often require a bit of subjective intervention on the part of the translator. So let's first look at some examples from Dictée by Teresa Hakim-Cha. So for a bit of context, this book is about agency. It puts forth a poetics of vulnerability and reminds us of the fragility of language and languages. It portrays the difficulty speaking in English and French experienced by the Korean author while enrolled in a French Catholic school in San Francisco, and more generally refers to the condition of the Korean people under Japanese occupation, when they could not speak Korean. The fact that the text is about agency also makes it interesting to think about how to translate it. The minority voice here is not affirmative, but dwells in a kind of ambiguity as to the possibility of mastering any of the languages present. So we might wonder how translation then can speak for itself. Similarly, the question is raised: how can the translation ever be fully emancipated from the source text or author? A glance at the writing allows us to identify French and English as dominant, as well as a minor presence of Korean, Chinese, and Latin. But in addition to the presence of potentially foreign languages, depending on the competence of the reader, there are few moments in her text when we can be assured that we are in fact reading one of these languages. She puts us in the position of having to learn her language, its syntax, grammar, vocabulary, and far from treating errors as elements of style inserted here and there, she challenges really our ability to even identify one language or the other and to single out precisely where the foreign is. Here's the beginning of this. So translating Cha means translating mostly French and English, but never only from one of these languages, as Korean is a kind of hypotext that also has to be translated or has to remain beneath the translation. This first excerpt is the first page of the book, which opens like this, presents two paragraphs, one in French and one in English, which are not the exact translation of each other, if a translation, such a thing exists, exact translation, but use different structures and different verb tenses. Both contain what could be considered grammatical or spelling errors, but these are placed on different elements in each text. A general strategy applicable to the entire work could be to translate as literally as possible in order to reproduce the impression of an accent given off by the source text, which often appears to be the result of a literal translation to French or English from Korean. But it all depends also toward which language we're translating. In translating toward a language other than French or English, how can both of these languages and the difference between them be maintained? In the case of the Korean translation, because the book has been translated to Korean by Kyung-Yoon Kim, the translator chose to consider English as the dominant language to be translated thus, since the text was published in the United States. And he kept the French as is, but added in the footnotes a Korean translation, simplifying, which greatly simplifies the text for readers. And in my case, my kind of experimental translation with this text, I decided to translate it to French. I could have simply not translated this page or inversed the paragraphs, but the readability of English for Francophones is not the same as the readability of French for Anglophones. And for the purpose of the exercise, I decided to translate each text to the other language. Again, not useful. I adopted a similar strategy when working on the bilingual self-translator Raymond Federman, and produced a completely useless translation that translated the French to English and the English to French. And I justified this by the fact that, similarly to Nabokov, Federman did not always self-translate, but opened his work to other translators and enjoyed the experience of translation. The first challenge here in translating this page was the grammatical errors. They needed to be maintained in order to mark the same distance from the standardized language. In other words, we're translating towards a language, not into it. And without necessarily seeking equivalence, it seemed judicious to try to reproduce the same kind and degree of mistake in function of the imagined reader, who in a multilingual text is never very easy to imagine. So the first example from just this excerpt, I had just this one little fragment, il n'y a qu'une chose, which in standard French would be written il n'y a qu'une chose with Q-U apostrophe. There is only one thing. And I chose to translate it as there's only one thing, without the apostrophe in theirs, which omits, so the unit of punctuation being equated more or less to the letter U being missing in the original. And both don't modify the pronunciation, but visually that we can detect the error. And similarly, the second example is il y a quelqu'une. So this is not exactly a grammatical error, but an intervention in the language to impose the feminine form of quelqu'un, someone, which is not typically used. And therefore a sort of political intervention in the text. And it says and does something to the standardized language as we normally know it. So this extra E on the quelqu'une here is seen and heard when we read it. It's not just quelqu'un, it's quelqu'une. So to translate a similar intervention needed to be done. I chose to translate basing my practice on that of the feminist translator, Suzanne de Lotbinière-Harwood, by creating the expression, some woman. So it does to the English language, so to speak, what the quelqu'une does to French. I want to look also just at one more from Dictée. It's a couple of pages which we find what resembles exercises for language learners. So the text is very fragmented. You have a little bit of story, and but you have these kind of meditations, and then you have these exercises and these fragments. And here the biggest challenge was the decision again to translate or not. Should it be left as is? And how can the references to French as well as the exercise of translating to French here be maintained in a French translation? So to translate these exercises, I thought it was necessary to consider the status of the French language in each of these exercises. To what extent was it important that it be the French language that's studied here? Could we replace it with English in a French language dominant translation? So in the first exercise, the original asks the readers to write in French, écrivez en français, which is for Anglophone readers a foreign language, but again, we can't necessarily presume that the readers of Dictée are monolingual. So I decided to keep the reference to the French language and leave the exercises in English. Why not? So the exercise becomes easier for French readers, obviously, and it's not as if they're necessarily going to do the exercise, but we can imagine that. And in any case, the readers are confronted to the foreign language of English. And the second exercise, so just below the traduire en français, I decided to translate to French, all of it, while keeping the reference to the French language. So it says traduire en français, et ensuite, and then below we have text in French. So this the idea was to have the readers consider what it would mean to conduct an interlingual translation, to notice the difference between standard French and the French of Teresa Hakim Cha here, which I, in these texts, I translated somewhat literally. So the difficulty here was deciding who's the reader of this translation and what effects he or she should perceive as indicative of the difficulty situating, it's indicative of the difficulty situating this text in any one space. So the questions of translation are also the same questions that we have when we read this text in reality. The same ambiguity and the reading must be reproduced in the reading of the translation as well and through the translation practice. Without being entirely outside of languages, which of course is impossible in literature, we're definitely in a different paradigm that presumes and demands a translative horizon other than just moving from one language to another. So quickly, I'm going to look at the second work, which is by Kathleen Molnar, called Contagieux. This is a 230-page work, mostly written in a language that the author calls Molnarian, like her last name. And it's produced by transcribing the author's spoken French with a Hungarian accent, which makes the written text look as if it were truly written in another language. You have to read the text aloud to fully appreciate it. So there's a question of the difference between oral French and written French, and the different types of variations of French that exist. And she calls this, in the novel, she calls it simple et prolétaire, simple and proletarian, which obviously presents some contradictions when you see how difficult this is to read. But that's her goal, is so to speak, her goal within the novel. And we see how a translation that would use standardized language would be completely faulty and of absolutely no interest, as it would entirely destroy the system that Molnar attempts to put in place through her writing. So it's interesting to see how in some cases where we have a kind of lighter, so to speak, heterolingualism or multilingualism, we translators have fewer qualms leveling the text. But in this kind of text where we see that that would totally destroy the poetics, we obviously can't do that. So we have to think of other practices. And my idea is that thinking of other practices is pertinent to really kind of all texts that contain any kind of, or put forth any kind of heterolingualism. So this text requires us to translate in transcribing, which is not always easy to do in the same way as in French, because in some languages, depends again what language we're translating to, like Spanish or Italian, for example, almost every letter is pronounced. So we don't have this difference between the written and the spoken. In addition, the challenge is to produce the same distancing effect from the standard language as in the source text. In attempting a translation of the book's title, we first have to deconstruct what's happening in this title. So it was quant à je, so it's a deformation of the expression quant à moi, which means as for me, or in my opinion. And there's also the expression rester sur son quant à moi, which means that the person is keeping their distance from others, which is in fact what the text is doing here, a distance from the language. The pronoun je is also reminiscent of jeu or game in French, which reminds us of her playful interventions in the French language. So we kind of translate backwards from quant à je. We know that it's already translated in a way from quant à moi to quant à je, and transcribed then transcribed into her phonetic language to become quant à je in parentheses. So she's confronting here the written version and the way it's said. The second in parentheses doesn't replace the transcription, it's simply added in a way of echoing the entire poetic process. And in the transcribed expression quant à je, we also hear the French word contagieux, which means contagious, which resonates with what the work is doing also, contaminating the French language by revealing its differences to itself. And in translating to English, we first have to translate the standard French version. So quant à moi becomes as for me. Then, as English also has two first-person personal pronouns, me and I, we can easily conduct the same operation to deform the expression, which then becomes as for I. Then to translate the transcription, quant à je, we can transcribe this orally, which renders something like as for I. And this would vary, of course, depending on one's pronunciation. And when we read it separately, we see the word as for a to get something similar, and actually somewhat similar to the idea of contagion, or it produces a similar effect in that foray refers to an incursion or a sudden attack on an enemy territory, as well as a first attempt at something, which reminds readers also that our translation is only a first attempt and that it can and should be continued or redone. The translation strays, of course, from the signified, but it doesn't mean, in my opinion, you can tell me, that it's less just. And what's more, it echoes with the process of translation at hand in the original text. So from these different experiences in translation, we gain an improved appreciation of the complexity of these bi, multi, or heterolingual poetics. The difficult passage to a language or delimited space reminds us of the complex spaces in which these texts have been produced and read. And we've seen with these two examples that works cannot be translated without an understanding of this complexity, nor without a vision of translation that considers the specific poetic value of each text. In some elements, if some elements are indeed untranslatable, it is because we cannot translate these works into a single language. Translating the multilingual leads us to a conception of language that's always more than one language, and consequently a vision of translation not as passage, which emphasizes the distance between languages, but as a third space of contact that reconfigures the relationships of languages to each other. Translation is therefore never finished. It's always reconfigurable. It's movement that can manifest itself in one, two, or an infinite number of texts. And I will conclude with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Amanda. That went well from your basement. Very dynamic paper, and what I like about it is the way in which you managed to bring together a number of theoretical, almost philosophical reflections with, you know, hands-on practice. And just to get the conversation going, I'd like to ask you if you're planning to publish these translations, if this is part of the projects that you were mentioning.
So for the moment, no. Well, I would like to publish the translation of Dictée into French, because it has been published in other languages, and there have been a series of adaptations as well in dance and theater. And I think that, and the work has had some resonance lately in Europe. And so I think there's a possibility of potentially publishing that. The other translations I think are more experimental, more for my research. And I'm in the process of preparing the manuscript of my dissertation. So I have all of these, attempts to translate in the third part of my dissertation, which is on the translation of multilingual texts. So
yeah.
So, yes.
Good, nice prospects. Any questions from the floor? I don't know if Julie or anyone else would like to comment on Amanda's paper. Feel free to come forward. Celestine?
Yes, it's a very open question. I'm not expecting a definite answer, but I thought it was really interesting at the beginning of your presentation, Amanda, when you said, does there have to be a main language in a text? And yeah, why would there have to be? But at the same time, I thought back to what Julie said about the two translations of Lolita, and how you said that one of them would be for an audience who would want to have the French, who'd like the French language, and the other one would be for a different type of audience. And it got me thinking for the whole thing of, does there have to be a main language? If there isn't, wouldn't there be, I mean, would that mean that it enlarges the possible audience of a text, or on the contrary, does it restrict it to a very limited set of people who would have an affinity with all of the languages in the text. I don't know if I'm making sense, but if you have any thought on that, I don't know.
Yeah, so I think that the question of the address of a heterolingual or multilingual text is definitely very complicated. To know who is this text writing to, or written for, or is it written for anyone? And I think, I don't know. I think we have to kind of point to the experimental nature of these texts as well, and that they're already aimed for reduced audience. So any kind of, like I said, any kind of translation or treatment of these texts would also be aiming for a similar audience. And I think the idea of it not being in any one language takes us out of that, out of the paradigm also, or the any kind of questions surrounding publication. Because if we're talking about something that's going to be published, we're obviously thinking of a public, right, an audience, or a place where it's going to be published. So there's kind of a tension between what the texts do and then their actual sociological reality as published texts. I don't really have an answer to that. It was more just to kind of
absolutely. And I always kind of have to think about maybe commercial considerations as well. How would even with the very experimental texts that you've mentioned, how does the commercial aspect fit into all of that? I guess it's a very touchy question for publishers if they have to publish such a text. Anyway,
I think it's the same questions are raised whether it's a translation or an original in this case. Mm-hmm. It's just as ambiguous who it's published for or who's going to publish it, or uncertain.
Yeah, that's an important point. I think even the authorship of the original text is very indefinite. That it so much depends on the linguistic repertoire of the reader and his or her biographical background. It occurred to me, I discovered a wonderful story by Denise Chavez, a Chicana writer, The Last of the Menu Girls, in one of the older editions of the Northern Anthology of American Literature. Initially, it had been published by a small local bilingual publishing house somewhere in the south of America, in Texas or something. The sheer fact of that text being published in the Northern Anthology changes so much, because the intended readership, the context and so forth and so on, and that adds an enormous degree of indefiniteness and openness to the whole project, starting with the source text, of course.
Yeah, and I think it definitely does something for, well, it obviously does something for its readership, but it may change the issues at hand. I mean, when we have anthologies, texts are received alongside other texts, so they're more easily appropriated by certain movements or ideologies potentially as well. Not to say that it shouldn't be in an anthology, but there's always the risk of either reducing it to some minority group or something, or on the contrary, or not on the contrary, but making it, I don't know, reducing its specificity or picking out one element to focus on. And this has happened with Teresa Hakim Cha, actually. In the United States, she's actually pretty well read in universities, but only in Asian American studies classes, and they don't really study the multilingual aspects of her poetics. So yeah, it's an example.
Thank you. I'm looking at the clock, and I'm also looking at Tifan, who's also looking at her clock, perhaps. We have room for one more question, at least.
Yeah, definitely. I was just going to say, Amanda, I think that what you're saying is very interesting, and that it can be applied to a lot of texts produced by or featuring the voice of minority groups, that we tend to see them for the anthropological value rather than for their stylistic or their poetic value. I wanted to quickly bounce off something that you said when you were talking about the translations that you did. You said that they were useless when you were translating the English bits into French and the French bits into English. But I was thinking to myself that maybe actually, I mean, obviously they're not useless regardless, but that maybe what you were doing was producing complementary texts, and that like the logistical difficulties of aligning two texts like that and finding the right passages at the right time might be a way of recreating the instability of a multilingual text as you read it on the page. And so it's like it's a reconfiguration of the instability in the original text.
Yeah, that actually is that's pretty much what I meant, because when I said useless, I mean useless in terms of publication or
okay.
But not useless for research, of course, and for the poetic process in itself as adding another version or reconfiguration of the languages in contact already in the first version.
Thank you. Is there another question or comment from the floor? Julie, with your work on collaborative translation, do you think you can see a way in which the texts that were presented to us by Amanda could be tackled? I think one danger with collaborative work is that the text loses its sense of coherence, the voice. You end up with something that is less focused perhaps and coherent as the text that you started from.
I mean, I guess when you work on a living author, which is not the case for Nabokov, this is interesting to have their vision. And I think the idea of translating French into English and English into French is interesting, because if your author speaks those languages, if we go back to the author of Dictée, that's pretty nice to know what they would think about that. I don't know if you reached out. I mean, I don't know this author, and if she's still alive.
No, she was actually murdered by a stranger at the age of 32. So she's very prolific. She produced a lot in her short time, and I think if she had lived longer, she would have been very recognized. But I have reached out. For example, one of the authors I've worked on is Nicole Brossard in Quebec, and I did have I've had a few conversations with her, not about that particularly, but it is definitely when you're working on someone and translating them, and you know that they have the capacity to read what you're doing or to potentially collaborate, it's definitely a different dynamic. But I think just as interesting, or even, I mean, potentially more stimulating, because you have kind of that pressure of the potential intervention of the author, which Nabokov obviously did with his translators.
Thank you. Now, it's important, I think, that you underlined the experimental nature and the modernist nature also of the work by Nabokov, but we find a lot of multilingualism in more traditional, classical, canonized literary texts, as in the example, for example, in the example of the Professor by Charlotte Bronte, which is a spectacularly multilingual novel, and one which is indeed very challenging to translate into French, because here the embedded language is French and English is the matrix language, so it's absolutely everywhere. But it's good to look at those experimental texts, because they probably challenge our theoretical concepts to the utmost.
Yes, sorry, go ahead, Julie.
No, I was just going to say that a colleague worked on translating French into French in Bronte's, so not the Professor, but Villette.
Of course, yeah.
So she's called Véronique Béguin, if anyone is interested in that topic. Sorry, Amanda.
No, I was just going to say that I think these this working on these kind of radically multilingual or experimental texts give us ideas for all texts. I mean, they reveal or put forth something that's happening or that we could detect if we were very attentive to in a lot of other texts. I think it's just kind of an example or an augmented form of what we do when we translate other apparently more simple texts that maybe aren't so simple, but we choose to translate with normative practices when we can.
Mm-hmm. And so far we've avoided referring to Finnegan's Wake somehow, which is of course another ultimate example. I once read about the challenge of translating Finnegan's Wake is the first challenge and the most difficult one might be to identify the source language, to figure out of which language you're meant to translate the book. And that takes the whole idea of translating multilingualism to the next level, I would imagine.
Right, so I think we might have to wrap up here, unfortunately. But thanks again, Dirk, for agreeing to chair the session and then carrying out the chairing so masterfully. And thanks to both Julie and Amanda again for sharing your research with us and giving us lots of things to think about. Just as a reminder, our next session is in 2 weeks. It's on the 21st of April at the same time, same place on your computer. And it's on translating the Maghreb. And so we'll have 3 researchers, 2 researchers working together, and then 1 researcher presenting her own work to do with the translation issues in translating the Maghreb. And another quick reminder, if you're subscribed to our email list, you would have got the email yesterday. But Julie is actually very busy at the moment this week and is presenting a paper again tomorrow on, if I'm not mistaken, the use of they, or the translation of they, the subtitling of they, the pronoun they, in 2020's television series, if I'm not mistaken, Julie, that's right.
Yeah, it's on there as a non-binary pronoun and how you translate that into French. So yell and much more. Yes, indeed. Thank you.
So that's tomorrow afternoon through the University of Lille. And so we sent out the link yesterday to a mailing list. But if you didn't get it and you would like to attend virtually, shoot us an email. Also, you can have a look on our website to sign up to the mailing list if you're not already signed up. Amanda, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, just a little bit of publicity as well. So I'm also organizing an event on this very similar topic at the Sorbonne Nouvelle. It's actually at the Maison de la Recherche de la Sorbonne Nouvelle, the 28th and 29th of April. There's 2 days on what we've entitled Friction des langues. So it's on translation and multilingualism and how languages are in friction within a text. And of course, the question of translation is there as well. So the program, I think, has been posted to Fabula and some other networks, so you can find it. I will just put it here also in the chat.
Great, thanks. Is it only in person or is it online?
It's in person. I don't think we're going to do it online.
Okay, right, okay. So if you happen to be in Paris at the end of April, head on along. But I'll put the link on the website as well so that people are aware of it as well. But yeah, thanks everybody again for attending and for being involved, and we hope to see you again in 2 weeks, or if not, at another session very soon.
Yeah, thank you very much for talking, sharing, attending. It's been very lovely. Thank you.
And thanks to the organizers.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Have a good
2 weeks.